Two headlines appear on screen, side by side. Boise, Idaho, named most affordable city for remote workers, Forbes 2021. Boise home prices up 58%. Locals priced out of their own city. Idaho Statesman 2022. Hold for 3 seconds. Then, one question, in plain text centered on a black screen. What happened to the people who got there in 2022? No music swell, no dramatic sting, just that question, sitting there. Because here's the thing nobody followed up on. The publications that ran the glowing relocation guides, the listicles, the cost of living calculators, the best cities for remote workers rankings, they moved on. New content cycle, new list, new city.
But the people who actually moved, they're still there. Sitting in homes they bought at prices that made sense, under conditions that no longer exist, in cities that were sold to them as solutions and turned into something else entirely. This is not a story about the remote work boom. That story has been told. This is the story of what happened after. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what people were actually told. Between 2020 and 2022, a very specific financial argument was being made, loudly, repeatedly, and with a lot of charts, across every personal finance platform, real estate blog, and LinkedIn thought leadership post in existence. The argument went like this. You are earning a San Francisco salary, or a New York salary, or a Seattle salary. You are now allowed to work from anywhere. If you relocate to a city where the median home price is $280,000 instead of $1.1 million, you will immediately become wealthy by comparison. You will buy a home with a yard. You will have disposable income. You will win. The cities attached to this argument had names: Boise, Spokane, Chattanooga, Asheville, Knoxville, Tucson, Salt Lake City, Greenville, South Carolina. The list ran long, and it ran in every major publication that had a personal finance vertical, which is to say, all of them.
What the argument did not account for, what none of the calculators, none of the guides, and none of the YouTube channels mentioned, was a basic principle of economics that every one of those publications' business reporters absolutely knew. When enough people with above median incomes move to a market at the same time, they change the market. The price discovery mechanism doesn't care that you moved there to save money. It only sees demand. And between 2020 and 2022, these cities saw demand they had never seen before and had no structural capacity to absorb. The result was not gradual. It was violent. Here is a number worth pausing on. In Boise, Idaho, the median home price went from roughly $310,000 in early 2020 to over $550,000 by mid-2022. That is a 77% increase in approximately 26 months. To put that in context, the national median home price increase over the same period was significant, roughly 40%, and was itself described as a historic anomaly. Boise nearly doubled it. Spokane, Washington, up 62% peak to peak. Chattanooga, Tennessee, up 48%. Asheville, North Carolina, up 51%. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a smaller market adjacent to Spokane, briefly became one of the fastest appreciating housing markets in American history, with prices up over 70% in under 2 years. These were not cities with supply constraints in the traditional sense. They were not Manhattan, where you physically cannot build enough. They were mid-sized American cities, with land, with infrastructure capacity, and with historical home price appreciation measured in single-digit percentages per year. What they didn't have was the ability to absorb a migration wave that arrived faster than permits could be pulled, faster than contractors could be hired, faster than anyone had modeled. So prices moved, brutally and fast. And here's what made it worse for the people already living there. The remote workers arriving with San Francisco salaries were not price sensitive at $450,000. That number to someone earning $160,000 a year while paying $4,200 a month in rent in the Bay Area looked like a bargain. They bid over asking. They waived inspections. They paid cash in some cases. The nurse at Boise earning $68,000 a year, the one who grew up there, whose parents were there, who had been saving for 5 years toward a down payment on a $290,000 house, she was now competing in a market she had been priced out of before she knew the rules had changed. Consider what happened in Asheville, North Carolina. Asheville had spent a decade building a reputation as a mid-sized cultural city. Art scene, food scene, mountain access, a genuinely functional downtown. It attracted a certain type of relocating remote worker, someone who wanted lifestyle, not just cheap square footage. By 2021, it was appearing on every aspirational relocation list being published. Home prices followed, sharply. But Asheville had an additional problem layered underneath the affordability collapse. It had, and this would not become a national story until 2024, aging water infrastructure that was already under strain before the population surge. When Hurricane Helene struck in September 2024, it exposed how fragile that infrastructure actually was. Parts of the city lost water access for weeks. The event accelerated an outflow of residents that had already quietly begun as remote work mandates pushed people back toward their companies' home cities. The people who had bought in Asheville at 2021 peak prices were now holding assets in a market softening from those peaks, in a city that had received national coverage for infrastructure failure, competing to sell to a buyer pool that had suddenly become very cautious about Western North Carolina. That is not a generalized risk. That is a specific compounding trap. Now, move to Boise. Boise's correction from its 2022 peak was among the sharpest in the country. By late 2023, median prices had pulled back somewhere between 10 and 18% from peak, depending on neighborhood and property type. That sounds survivable, until you do the math on someone who bought in April 2022 at the top with 5% down in a market that has since declined. They are underwater or near it. In a city where the job market, which was never deep enough to support someone with a specialized tech or finance background, has not appreciably expanded. Where the cost of living, while still lower than San Francisco in absolute terms, is no longer lower by the margin that justified the move. And the company that told them they could work from anywhere? Some issued return-to-office mandates in 2023. Some did layoffs. Some did both. Chattanooga ran a program, widely covered, frequently cited, called the Gig City Remote Worker Incentive, offering $10,000 to qualifying remote workers who relocated there. The program attracted attention. It attracted residents. It did not attract the job market diversification that would have made those residents economically stable if their remote position disappeared. Spokane's situation carries a particular irony. It sits in eastern Washington, geographically and culturally distinct from Seattle. It was marketed as the affordable alternative for Seattle tech workers who wanted to stay in the Pacific Northwest. The problem is that eastern Washington is not the Pacific Northwest that Seattle tech workers actually know. The weather is different, the culture is different, the professional network is not there. And as RTO pressures mounted in 2023 and 2024, the calculation that Spokane was close enough to Seattle, a 4 to 5 hour drive, not a commute, began to look much less tenable. Here is the part that did not make the migration content, the part that the relocation blogs did not publish. The remote work migration wasn't an escape from the housing crisis. It was the mechanism that exported the housing crisis to cities that didn't have one. That reframing matters because it shifts the narrative entirely. The standard telling of this story positions remote workers as victims of circumstance, people who made a reasonable decision based on available information and got caught by a reversal they couldn't have predicted. And there is truth in that. Most of them were not making reckless decisions. They were following the consensus advice of the financial media, the real estate industry, and in some cases, their own employers,
who held up relocation as a feature of the new work model. But the aggregate effect of those individually rational decisions was to function as a displacement mechanism. The crisis that had defined housing in expensive coastal metros for a decade, the one where working and middle-class residents couldn't afford to live where they worked, was picked up and deposited in compressed form and accelerated timeline into cities that had been insulated from it.
Boise didn't have a housing affordability problem in 2019. It does now, and it will continue to, because the prices, even after partial correction, did not return to pre-migration levels. The floor moved permanently. The nurse who was priced out in 2021 is still priced out in 2025. The remote worker who bought at peak is sitting on a depreciating or stagnant asset in a market with limited exit liquidity. Everyone lost something. The only people who didn't were the ones who sold in 2021 and 2022 at peak, and many of them were locals cashing out and leaving, which accelerated the community disruption these cities are still recovering from.
So what happens to the remote worker who can no longer work remotely? This is the question that sits at the center of the story, and it has been largely ignored because the answer is uncomfortable and doesn't fit a clean content format. What happens is this: they are trapped. Not metaphorically, financially. They own a home they cannot sell without taking a loss or breaking even at best. They are in a city where the professional market for their skill set is thin. If their employer issued a return-to-office mandate, they have a choice between a commute that is geographically impossible and a resignation that puts them in the job market while carrying a mortgage that requires income to service.
Some are doing the commute, flying back to their home city 1 to 3 weeks per month, maintaining what the industry has started calling a bi-city lifestyle. This is expensive. It is exhausting. It is not a permanent solution. It is a bridge strategy while they decide whether to take the loss on the house or hold and wait. Some are holding, renting out the property and relocating back temporarily to their original city or near their employer, becoming reluctant landlords in markets where being a landlord has gotten more complicated and less profitable since they bought.
Some are simply stuck, making it work, grinding through a situation they did not fully model when they signed the purchase agreement. And layered underneath all of this is a job market dynamic that rarely gets discussed in the relocation content. The cities that attracted remote workers did not add major employers to match the population growth. The infrastructure of opportunity, the professional networks, the industry clusters, the hiring ecosystem that exists in a San Francisco or a New York or an Austin did not materialize in Chattanooga or Spokane because people with tech salaries moved there. Talent clusters don't form that way. They form around capital, around institutions, around decades of compounding industry presence. Which means the remote worker who moved to one of these cities and then lost their remote position is not just geographically stranded. They are professionally stranded in a market that cannot absorb them at the compensation level their mortgage was underwritten against. The individual stories of regret are real and they are spreading. But the more important story is what they signal at scale. The United States is now carrying a cohort of homeowners concentrated in the exact cities that were promoted as relocation destinations between 2020 and 2022, who are financially fragile in ways that don't show up cleanly in aggregate default statistics. They are not in foreclosure.
They are current on their payments, but they bought at peak prices in markets that have softened with income assumptions that are now under pressure. That cohort is a slow-motion risk, not a 2008-style systemic event, something quieter and more chronic. It depresses transaction volume in those markets because people won't sell at a loss unless they have to. Depressed transaction volume means reduced price discovery, means the market price signals become harder to read, means the next buyer has less information than they should.
It concentrates financial stress in mid-sized cities that don't have the institutional capacity, the large hospital systems, the diversified employment bases, the deep municipal revenue to absorb stress the way a major metro can. And it creates a generation of people whose first significant real estate experience was buying into a market on the way to a top they didn't recognize as a top, losing mobility as a result, and living in the gap between the life the calculator promised and the one they're actually in. That is going to shape how this cohort approaches financial decisions for decades.
The first-time buyer who got to Boise in 2022 and is now underwater is not going to be an eager buyer in the next market cycle. The trust isn't there. Every migration wave looks like opportunity at the front end. The people who moved in 2020 and 2021, early in the wave, largely did well. They bought at prices that were still reasonable. They got ahead of the appreciation. Some of them made significant equity gains, even in markets that subsequently corrected. The people who moved in 2022, who followed the same guides, used the same calculators, read the same articles, arrived at the back end of something that had already happened.
The opportunity had been converted into risk by the volume of people chasing it. That is how it always works. The content that promotes a trend is always written on the way up. The accounting comes later, quietly, without a publication date, and without the same distribution. The cities being promoted right now as the next affordable alternatives, the ones appearing on the 2024 and 2025 lists, are running the same analysis that produced those Boise headlines. Cost of living today, quality of life today, affordability today. Not affordability after the list runs, not quality of life after 5 years of in-migration pressure, not the employment base 3 years from now if the job that brought you there disappears. The calculator is always right about where the market is. It is silent about where the market is going. And that silence is where the regret lives.